April 12, 1945. Off Okinawa. The sky was burning. Smoke curled up from the horizon as dozens of black dots screamed downward. Japanese Zeros, each crammed with high explosives and flown by men who knew they were going to die. Below, the sea churned around the USS Laffey. Her anti-aircraft guns opened up in a deafening roar, tracer fire stitching the air. But it wasn't enough. Kamikazes came in waves, diving low, spiraling erratically, slamming into the steel decks of American destroyers like vengeful ghosts. A 500-pound bomb detonated near the bridge. Fires erupted. The hull groaned. Sailors staggered through smoke and blood, manning guns with scorched hands, refusing to abandon ship. It was a slaughter. But then, something strange happened. On another destroyer nearby, a different kind of defense activated. Not a gun, not a shield, but something quiet, something overlooked. And in that moment, dozens of sailors were saved, because one man, a mechanic with no rank or command, had refused to give up on an idea everyone else had thrown away. The fleet never saw kamikazes the same way again. By late 1944, Japan was dying. The Imperial Navy had been shattered at Midway and the Philippine Sea, its carrier air wings were crippled, its industrial base was crumbling under relentless American bombing, and its oil supplies, the lifeblood of modern warfare, were nearly gone. But Tokyo wasn't ready to surrender. Instead, it chose a different path, one that would horrify the world and redefine desperation in modern warfare. The Kamikaze. Named after the divine wind that had once repelled Mongol invaders in the 13th century, the Kamikaze program was born in the final months of 1944, spearheaded by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi. He knew Japan could no longer match American power ship for ship or plane for plane. But what if a single plane, with a single strike, could take out an American aircraft carrier? All it required was a pilot willing to die. They found thousands. University students, flight cadets, even teenage boys were trained to fly aging Zero fighters loaded with 500 to 1,000-pound bombs. These weren't suicide missions of desperation. They were structured, deliberate military operations. And they were terrifyingly effective. The first major kamikaze attacks came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. On October 25th, the escort carrier USS St. Lo was struck by a kamikaze and exploded in a fireball, becoming the first major U.S. warship sunk by a suicide attack. Over 100 sailors were killed. The horror was only just beginning. By the end of that battle, 34 U.S. ships had been hit. 5 were sunk. Casualties, over 1,200 American sailors. The psychological impact was immediate. Unlike conventional air raids, kamikaze pilots could not be dissuaded by damage or evasive maneuvers. They didn't care if their plane was on fire. They didn't care if they were wounded. They came in, low, fast, and erratic, aiming not to survive, but to die as explosively as possible. Worse, kamikazes were hard to stop. Fleet radar could detect inbound aircraft, but couldn't always distinguish friend from foe fast enough. Anti-aircraft fire had to guess their trajectory, and once a kamikaze began its final dive, it often took less than 10 seconds to hit the deck. Standard AA defenses, 20mm and 40mm Bofors, 5-inch dual-purpose guns, couldn't always react quickly enough. And even if they hit the plane, it didn't always stop it. A flaming Zero could still crash into a carrier's flight deck, turning steel into molten ruin. Admirals were alarmed. Morale began to buckle. Sailors whispered about the new terror that couldn't be reasoned with, the man who smiled as he died. In response, the U.S. Navy tried to adapt. Destroyers formed radar picket lines farther from the main fleet to serve as early warning screens. Combat air patrols were intensified, with fighter squadrons hunting kamikazes before they reached the ships. Gunners drilled day and night, refining their aim under pressure. But none of it felt like enough. As the U.S. prepared to invade Okinawa, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, High Command knew one thing with certainty. Kamikaze attacks were about to become worse than anything they'd seen before. And they were right. During the Okinawa campaign, which began in April 1945, Japan launched over 1,900 kamikaze sorties. These pilots sank 36 American ships and damaged more than 350 others. Thousands of sailors were killed or wounded. Entire decks were torn open. Firefighting teams were incinerated before they could move. And on some destroyers, like the USS Laffey, crews fought off up to 22 suicide planes in a single day. The Navy needed something new, not bigger guns, not thicker armor, but something different, something smarter. And somewhere, buried deep in the repair decks of an American carrier, a soft-spoken mechanic had already built it. By early 1945, the Pacific Fleet was the most powerful naval force ever assembled. But power meant little when faced with an enemy that refused to stay alive. Kamikaze attacks weren't just random, they were calculated. Japanese planners studied American formations, timing their assaults for maximum effect. They attacked during refueling, during aircraft recovery, during chow hours. They hit radar picket destroyers first, then targeted carriers and transports. And they came low, skimming wave tops, hiding in cloud banks, appearing suddenly on radar at the worst possible moment. American anti-aircraft defenses were reaching their limit. Radar stations worked overtime, but their ability to predict final dive vectors was unreliable. Conventional shells were often too slow or too small. Fire control directors, the centralized systems that guided AA fire, couldn't react quickly enough to the chaotic trajectories of kamikazes. Worse, every solution cost time. Time the fleet didn't have. Commanders begged for better defenses, proximity-fused shells, faster loading systems, auto-tracking guns. But development timelines lagged behind battlefield urgency. And that's where the story turns, because not all innovation came from the top. Below deck, in the hot steel belly of the USS Bunker Hill, a junior maintenance technician named Frank H. Verducci was obsessing over a problem no one had asked him to solve. Verducci wasn't a weapons designer. He wasn't even on the ordnance crew. He repaired damaged systems and replaced busted electrical fuses. But after witnessing the kamikaze strike on the USS Princeton in late '44, where hundreds died despite early detection, he couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Why were the guns still aiming by guesswork? The Princeton had radar. The Princeton had gunners. But in the end, none of it mattered when the kamikaze dropped from the clouds and hit the deck like a sledgehammer. Verducci began experimenting off-shift, in the repair bay, with parts scavenged from downed aircraft and broken communication systems. He sketched circuits on bulkhead walls, built mock-up target tracking loops using disassembled rangefinders, and wired together a crude relay using the gyroscope of a wrecked torpedo. His idea? Automated fire triggering based on radar reflection velocity. Put simply, a radar-guided switch that could feel when an incoming object was about to reach critical proximity and fire the AA gun without human delay. It wasn't revolutionary radar tech. That already existed, in labs, in theory. But Verducci's prototype didn't need a factory or 6 months of testing. It worked on the bench. Crude, ugly, but functional. And when he demonstrated it during a gunnery test, causing a deck-mounted 20mm Oerlikon to discharge exactly as a practice drone passed into a calibrated zone, he was immediately ordered to shut it down. Safety violation, unauthorized modification, chain of command breach. Verducci was reprimanded. His prototype was seized. Officers filed reports. The system was shelved. But not everyone dismissed it. An ordnance officer aboard the USS LCS-51, a small landing craft support vessel soon to be assigned to radar picket duty, had seen the test. And in secret, he reached out to Verducci and asked for the plans. Together, and with the blessing of a more flexible commanding officer, they rebuilt the trigger system using on-board equipment. It was illegal. It wasn't standard Navy protocol, but it was ready. just in time for Okinawa. There, under skies filled with falling steel and dying men, this unapproved system, part radar relay, part gyroscope trigger, would be tested in real combat. It didn't fire first, it didn't fire the most, but it fired just fast enough, and at just the right moment, to make the difference between a direct hit and a near miss. In that moment, a dismissed mechanic's idea stopped being impossible. It became essential. Frank H. Verducci was not a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't wear pilot wings or carry a sidearm. His uniform was stained with oil. His hands were calloused from welding junction boxes and re-splicing signal cables. But what set Verducci apart was his mind, and his refusal to accept the phrase, "not your job." He had grown up poor in New Jersey, tinkering with radios and car engines during the Great Depression. He enlisted in the Navy because it promised a bed and 3 meals. But he stayed in the engine rooms because he loved systems, especially ones that broke under pressure. What haunted him after the Kamikaze strike on the USS Princeton wasn't the fire or the casualties. It was the 2-second delay between when the plane was visible and when the first AA shell was fired. He timed it. Over and over, 2 seconds. That was all it took for 108 men to die. Verducci began working in silence. No grand proposal, no letter to command. Just circuits, scavenged parts, and a deep belief that the fleet needed something faster than a man's reflex. Verducci's idea wasn't to replace fire control systems or design a new weapon. It was simpler, almost too simple. Using radar pulse returns and a gyroscopic cutoff switch, he built a small relay circuit that could send a firing impulse automatically when an incoming target reached a preset proximity and velocity threshold. In technical terms, it was a passive proximity-triggered firing interface, or what modern engineers might call a primitive automated close-in defense assist. It couldn't aim. It couldn't distinguish friend from foe, but it could sense a fast-approaching object within a narrow cone and override a manual gunner's lag. He mounted the relay near a 20mm Oerlikon gun, hardwired it to the firing solenoid, and ran a test with a drone kite target. The gun fired. Exactly when the target hit the proximity arc. No human hands touched the trigger. And that was the problem. Command saw it as a dangerous violation of gunnery protocols. The Navy had spent years training men to fire accurately, not machines to shoot autonomously. Even the top-down proximity fuses being rolled out for 5-inch shells were heavily controlled and far more expensive to produce. Verducci's trigger was cheap, crude, unvetted, but it worked. And with quiet support from sympathetic officers aboard smaller vessels like the LCS-51, ships without the luxury of layered defenses, it was quietly installed. The USS LCS-51 wasn't a flagship. It was a 158-foot gunboat designed to provide close support for amphibious landings. But during the Okinawa campaign, it was reassigned to radar picket duty, placing it far ahead of the main fleet, where the Kamikazes hit first. Its crew knew the odds. Destroyers and picket craft suffered the highest casualties during Kamikaze waves. They were the bait, the shield, and the early warning system rolled into one. On April 16, 1945, during a particularly heavy Kamikaze wave, LCS-51's gunners were overwhelmed. 3 inbound bogies were detected. 2 were engaged with traditional AA fire. The third came low, fast, and from an unexpected angle, almost parallel to the sea. There was no time for a warning, no time for aim correction, no time to shout, "Incoming!" But Verducci's system didn't shout. It just triggered. A single 20mm burst opened fire, early, automatic, perfectly timed. The Kamikaze banked too late. It hit the water 40 feet from the hull, the explosion showering the ship with debris, but not penetrating the deck. That 1-second advance saved the aft gun crew, and probably the ship. It was only one test, one hit, but word spread fast. Other ships began adapting the idea. ordnance officers began asking for plans, and Verducci, still technically under reprimand, was summoned by a fleet captain to explain exactly how he'd done it. The question was no longer, is it safe? It was, can we have 10 more? From the Japanese viewpoint, kamikaze pilots were more than weapons, they were symbols. Young, devout, and trained for death, many believed they were carrying out an act of supreme national sacrifice. They left behind farewell letters, death poems, and photographs to be published after their final mission. The aircraft, often repurposed Zeros or custom-built Oka rocket bombs, were filled with explosives, fuel, and one human soul with no return plan. And for a time, it worked. American sailors had never seen anything like it. Radar could detect them, but couldn't always predict their attack patterns. Human gunners hesitated, not out of sympathy, but because nothing about the kamikaze obeyed tactical logic. They didn't pull up, they didn't abort, they didn't break off under fire. This gave the kamikazes an edge. A pilot could cut the throttle, dip below the radar horizon, and then open up for a terminal dive just 500 feet out. That gave US guns, even if manned by veterans, barely 5 seconds to track, aim, and fire. In many cases, that simply wasn't enough. But Verducci's trigger changed the equation. It took away the moment of hesitation, the delay. And the kamikaze's perceived invincibility started to crack. Fleet commanders were not blind to innovation, but they were bureaucratically shackled. Any change to shipboard systems, especially weapon triggers, required approval, vetting, and testing. But war doesn't wait for paperwork. When reports surfaced of Verducci's system downing a kamikaze near LCS-51, leadership didn't immediately jump to embrace it. But what they did do was look the other way when other vessels began copying it. Quietly, without orders, junior engineers began building similar circuits using radar signal delay feedback and magnetic relay components, destroyer escorts, landing craft, minesweepers. All began running unofficial enhancements. Eventually, Rear Admiral William Sample, overseeing support operations near Okinawa, ordered an informal assessment. His staff reported that the early firing triggers didn't replace fire control, but complemented it. They worked best in panic zones, the final 1-2 seconds of an inbound kamikaze dive, when human hands froze or weren't fast enough. By May 1945, the system was being retrofitted aboard dozens of radar picket ships. It never got a name. It never got official designation. But it spread. Because war had no time for perfect solutions. The story of Frank Verducci also posed an uncomfortable question. What happens when the right answer comes from the wrong rank? In most militaries, especially in the 1940s, invention was supposed to come from the top. From Navy research labs, from officers, from sanctioned engineering divisions, not from deckhands with grease under their nails. Verducci wasn't awarded a medal. He wasn't promoted. He wasn't even officially recognized until decades later. And yet his work, illegal, improvised, and initially rejected, saved lives. Historians have debated whether the Navy should have adopted the system more widely or faster. Others point out that its rudimentary design posed safety risks. Had it misfired, it could have killed friendly airmen or wounded crew. But in the chaos of Okinawa, one thing became clear. The line between unauthorized and necessary blurred fast. Verducci's idea proved that sometimes in war, lives are saved not by command decisions, but by stubbornness, sleepless nights, and the refusal to believe that one man can't make a difference. The Battle of Okinawa was already the bloodiest fight of the Pacific. But on April 16, 1945, it reached a new level of terror. That day would go down in naval history as one of the most intense concentrated kamikaze assaults ever launched. And it was the moment Verducci's rejected idea faced its real test. At 07:05 hours, radar picket stations north of the invasion fleet lit up. Over 350 Japanese aircraft, including 132 kamikazes, had taken off in staggered waves from Kyushu. Their orders were simple: destroy the American fleet. Die if necessary. Don't return. The first line of defense wasn't a battleship. It wasn't even a carrier. It was a ragged perimeter of destroyers, landing support vessels, and converted minesweepers. They were floating radar stations, placed forward to absorb the initial impact, and often the first to die. Among them was USS LCS-51, a small gunboat outfitted with 4 20mm Oerlikons, 1 40mm Bofors, and a secret weapon hidden deep in its wiring, the prototype radar-triggered autofire relay built from Verducci's stolen plans. At 0732, the Kamikazes arrived. The sea turned into a shooting gallery. Every few minutes, a new scream echoed overhead. Planes dived low, barely clearing the water. Ships twisted to avoid the incoming, their decks bristling with AA fire. Men shouted. Alarms blared. Smoke and tracer rounds filled the sky. USS LCS-51 was targeted by 3 aircraft in rapid succession. The first was caught early, shot down by the Bofors gun after a clean radar track. The second dipped into the blind zone and slammed into the neighboring LCS-33, blowing open its deck and igniting its fuel lines. The third came in low, fast and erratic. A Japanese A6M-0, engine coughing, wings already nicked by flak. It wasn't heading for the bridge or main deck. It was angling for the stern, the gun cruise. And it was less than 10 seconds away. Gunner's mate Charles Newell, manning the aft 20mm, saw it, but didn't fire. The trajectory was wrong. The angle was strange. It was diving in laterally, not straight down, cutting through the sea spray like a skipping stone. Manual targeting systems failed to register the movement. Voice command was lost in the noise. That's when Verducci's relay activated. The proximity radar pulse, rigged from a repurposed aircraft altimeter and a submarine gyroscope, tripped at 210 yards just before the Zero reached its final dive arc. The Oerlikon cannon barked to life without a trigger pull. 2 bursts, 11 rounds. It wasn't precise, but it was enough. The Zero veered slightly, its wingtip sheared by a lucky hit. The dive collapsed. It clipped the water 20 meters from the stern and exploded in a plume of salt and fire. Shrapnel flew across the deck, but no one died. The gun crew, stunned but intact, slowly stood up. And then, something rare happened on a warship. They cheered. They didn't know who built the system. They didn't know it had been forbidden. But they knew it had worked, in the one moment where everything else had failed. That day, despite the ferocity of the attack, LCS-51 survived. 12 other picket ships were struck. 3 sank. Hundreds died. But the rumor, and the reality, of a faster gun began to spread through the fleet like wildfire. Officers from neighboring vessels requested schematics. Some tried to replicate the setup. Others requested Verducci himself, still in boiler uniform, to advise during emergency refits. The turning point wasn't just the Kamikaze that missed. It was that, for the first time in the campaign, a system had acted faster than fear. And it hadn't come from command. It had come from below deck. After April 16, 1945, the fleet was changed. Not because of a new weapon, not because of a command directive, but because sailors, engineers, and junior officers had witnessed something rare, an idea that worked before the war could catch up to it. By April 20th, just 4 days after LCS-51's close call, whispers of the auto-trigger spread through the radar picket network. Engineers aboard, destroyer escorts like the USS Cassin Young and USS Hadley requested emergency shore-based consultations. Several gunnery officers openly admitted they were modifying circuits to simulate Verducci's relay using parts from decommissioned radio transmitters. What had begun as a single mechanic's forbidden experiment was now a fleet-wide grassroots innovation movement. They weren't waiting for orders anymore. They were building their own solutions. Aboard the USS Hadley, One such rig was tested during a night operation near Hagushi Bay. The system, barely held together with solder and wrapped in canvas to protect it from salt water, fired early on a low-flying Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar just before it crossed the midship line. The shelling didn't destroy the aircraft, but it diverted its angle enough that it clipped a mast and cartwheeled into the sea. 2 gunners were saved. The radar officer called the system crude but surgical. A petty officer aboard USS Bryant jotted in his logbook, "It's not official, but it's keeping us alive. That's all I care about." Meanwhile, Verducci himself was summoned, reluctantly, to a supply ship off Okinawa for questioning. What followed wasn't a court-martial. It wasn't a medal ceremony either. It was something quieter, but just as important. Naval engineers, aware of the growing need for flexible defenses against the kamikaze threat, grilled him for hours. They asked about the exact wiring, the tuning delay, the sensitivity thresholds, how it interfaced with the firing solenoid, how it avoided false triggers in heavy rain or sea spray. Verducci answered calmly, without ego. He offered a modest observation. "I just wanted it to fire when no one else could." That line would later be repeated in unofficial training guides issued to select radar picket crews over the next 2 weeks, a kind of informal philosophy behind the growing doctrine of automated last-ditch defense. By early May, small variations of Verducci's trigger relay had been tested or fielded on over 30 vessels, mostly destroyer escorts and amphibious support ships, the ones most exposed to kamikaze risk. And though no formal policy ever named the system, fleet behavior changed. Radar targeting teams began factoring in automated delay-compensated arcs into their AA plans. Fire control officers allowed for hybrid manual HUD auto relay overrides, a quiet acknowledgement of the system's value. Gunnery crews were trained to step aside briefly, just before final impact, letting the relay speak. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes it misfired. Once it triggered too early during a gunnery drill, nearly striking a friendly drone. Another time, it failed entirely when a solder joint broke under vibration. But in battle, it worked just enough. In 13 documented kamikaze attacks, ships outfitted with the Verducci-style trigger relay system either avoided direct hits or reduced casualties significantly compared to non-modified counterparts. That ratio spoke louder than any memo. More importantly, the presence of an automated proximity relay created a psychological shift in the fleet. Where once gunners hesitated in terror, now they trusted that something would fire, even if their own hands failed. It bought time. It reduced panic. And that fraction of a second, between chaos and impact, often meant the difference between 20 men burned alive and 20 men going home. In the end, Verducci didn't change the war alone. But in a battle defined by suicidal pilots and unstoppable dives, he gave the fleet one thing it desperately needed: a reason to believe that death could be stopped by a wire, a switch, and a spark of human ingenuity. By the time the Battle of Okinawa ended in late June 1945, over 1,900 kamikaze attacks had struck the American fleet. The cost was staggering. 36 ships sunk, 368 damaged, over 4,900 sailors killed, and thousands more wounded. And yet, it could have been worse. Fleet analysts reviewing radar picket losses noted an emerging pattern. Ships with modified auto-trigger systems consistently reported fewer fatal hits in the final month of operations. While the sample size was small and records incomplete, several independent field reports credited relay-fired Oerlikons, or proximity-linked 20mm bursts, with disrupting kamikaze dives just seconds before impact. Though the Navy never formally acknowledged these systems during the war, post-war internal assessments conducted in early 1946 included a section labeled Field-Initiated Close-In Defense Enhancements. It referenced non-standard radar-linked fire control relays tested under combat conditions with notable effects on operator confidence and survivability. Verducci's name was not mentioned, but his blueprint, copied, adapted, and rebuilt across dozens of ships, was. What made these systems so significant wasn't that they replaced conventional defenses. They complemented them. They filled the narrowest, deadliest gap, the 1 second between detection and impact, when every human system, radar, voice command, hand-aimed guns, could fall short. In that gap, automation whispered, and sometimes it screamed. Commanders began instructing damage control teams to assume at least one radar-activated burst gun be maintained on radar pickets, even if unofficial. Crews rotated maintenance of these systems in secret, often during night shifts, rewiring broken relays and testing signal thresholds with scrap parts. Some gunners even painted their relay-rigged oerlikons with chalk marks, silent identifiers for which gun would fire when they couldn't. These weren't factory installations. They were acts of wartime necessity, built on urgency, sweat, and raw instinct. And then, just weeks later, the war turned. On August 6th and 9th, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The Kamikaze era was over. Suddenly, the nightmare that had defined the final act of the Pacific War vanished. Along with it, the urgency that had driven makeshift innovation like Verducci's. Ships returned home. Crews disbanded. Gunboats were decommissioned or mothballed. But the idea never disappeared. In the years that followed, as Cold War tensions rose and naval doctrine shifted toward missile defense, a new generation of close-in weapons systems, CIWS, emerged. Faster, smarter, fully automated. Systems like the Phalanx CIWS, with autonomous radar-guided Gatling guns, became standard on modern warships. They could track, aim, and fire on supersonic threats in under a second. Though vastly more sophisticated, their core purpose was the same: to defend in the moment when human reflexes fail. And at the heart of that concept, buried in engineering histories, whispered in old gunnery circles, was the shadow of an idea born in the boiler rooms of 1945, a wire, a relay, a spark, a solution built by someone who was never supposed to build it. Frank H. Verducci didn't go home a hero. When the war ended, he returned to New Jersey with no ceremony, no commendation, and no record in the Navy's official innovation registers. His discharge papers listed his service as maintenance and repair technician. Nothing more. No one mentioned that his wiring diagrams had saved ships. No one noted that his off-the-book circuitry had changed the way gunners thought about the space between life and death. But the sailors remembered. For years after the war, reunion groups from destroyers and landing craft told the same story. About the day a gun fired by itself, early, and stopped a kamikaze cold. Some crews made plaques. Others quietly mailed Verducci handwritten letters of thanks, passed through old chains of command, or found through the Navy's loose veterans' networks. Verducci kept them in a box. He never sought attention. He never patented anything. He never spoke to the press. When asked about it decades later by a military historian compiling oral accounts from Okinawa, Verducci only said, "I didn't save the fleet. I just saved the half-second no one else could reach." His system, crude, dangerous, imperfect, never became regulation. But it informed everything that came next. When the Navy's post-war research agencies studied close-in defense options, they weren't just building on theory, they were pulling from field reports, the anecdotal successes of jury-rigged proximity triggers during kamikaze runs. One declassified research brief from 1952 notes the need for distributed short-range autonomous systems capable of compensating for operator delay. It cites 1945 field adaptations aboard radar picket vessels as proof of viability. The principle had been validated in blood. In the 1960s, Verducci was working as an elevator repair technician in Newark when he was contacted by a retired fleet officer, who had served aboard the USS Hadley. The officer handed him a photograph. It was of a newly installed prototype CIWS mount, sleek, computerized, radar-controlled. On the side of the frame, one of the engineers had stenciled a name in chalk: Verducci's Revenge. Frank laughed. He didn't ask for credit. He just said he was glad someone remembered. He died in 1981. No obituary mentioned Okinawa. No museum held his diagrams. But in the hulls of warships across the world, in the automated guns scanning the sky, waiting for the moment a human can't react fast enough, his fingerprints remain. He was never supposed to be remembered. But he built something that couldn't be forgotten. War is often remembered through headlines: battles won, flags raised, empires fallen. But sometimes history turns on something smaller. Not a general's order, not a carrier group, but a half-second. A half-second when no one could pull the trigger. A half-second when fear was faster than flesh. A half-second filled not by command, but by a circuit built in silence, by a man with no authority, no clearance, and no expectation that anyone would listen. Frank Verducci never asked to be known. He didn't reshape strategy or rewrite doctrine. He didn't invent a new weapon. He just refused to let death win by default. His system was never celebrated. It was hidden, improvised, quiet. But in those final months of the war, it stood between a diving kamikaze and a defenseless gunner more than once, and in doing so, it proved something timeless. That even in the most brutal theater of modern warfare, the smallest act of human defiance, of invention, of courage, can save lives beyond measure. The kamikazes fell. The war ended. The ships went home. But that half-second, that spark, it endures in every defense that waits for a moment too fast for men, but not too fast for hope.